and I tried to be mindful of how I'm progressing through this role. It was new to me because up until that point, in the more recent parts of my career, I was building security products for other people to use. I was advising others for how to build their own security programs. And here was a chance to actually own and formalize a security program. And I haven't had to do that for quite a long time. So I wanted to share with you some of my lessons learned. Those of you who are tuning into this session live have the opportunity to pose questions to me if you would like. Type them up in your chat window, and I will keep an eye on that window as the session goes on. Sometimes I might answer your questions when they come in. Sometimes I might reserve the time to answer the questions until the very end of the session. So that's the plan. Reflections of a new CISO, that's me. My hope is that maybe you'll find this session useful because you are a CISO yourself, maybe new to the role, and you're wondering, what do other CISOs go through? Maybe this is going to be a form of therapy for you, and perhaps a form of therapy for me as well. Some of you tuning into this session might be wondering, what is it like to be a CISO, and is that a job that you should be pursuing? And I hope that those of you who are thinking about taking on such a role will find this session useful as well. So let's get going. I have 5 lessons that I'd like to share with you. So imagine me taking on a role and wondering, first of all, where am I? What company am I at? Who am I? That is, what exactly am I supposed to do here? And why am I? By that I mean, why am I here? All simple, relatively straightforward questions, but this is all about situational awareness. In my case, it helped that I was at this company earlier. Before taking on the CISO role, I was responsible for product management. So I knew what Axonius was about. I knew the people already. I had the benefit of getting to know our business objectives and how we operate. That was quite helpful. But in terms of what is the security team supposed to do, and specifically what is my role, well, that took some time to figure out. And I wanted to share with you how I defined the role in collaboration with my team. What were the goals of the security program that we have been trying to formalize? The security practices already existed, but here was an opportunity to formalize it, begin maturing it, begin scaling this program as our company was growing and scaling as well. So what were the goals for our security program? First of all, the team is expected to defend corporate and product environments according to our risk management principles. That was one of the objectives that we defined, communicated externally as well as within the organization. Next, my team needs to provide guidance to the R&D team who is building our product. Our company builds asset management software for addressing cybersecurity risks. So that's how and why we exist. Our goal is to guide the R&D team through the secure software development lifecycle. We also want to make sure that by creating a security program that we are proud of, that we can discuss publicly, at least to some extent, we're helping the organization grow by instilling the trust among our customers and prospects in our cybersecurity program. Now, regardless of what industry you work in, if you're working in a commercial sector, for sure, you've got customers, right? There's a reason why you exist as a business. You all have customers, and you all need to convince them, in most cases, that the customers that you have or the prospects that you're discussing a potential business relationship with can trust you with their sensitive information, and that was one of the goals for my team. And also, one of my goals is to educate the industry about cybersecurity practices as I figure them out. One of the reasons why I am talking to you right now is taking what I learned, sharing it with others to perhaps improve the state of our industry. And even more specifically, the product that my company makes is an asset management tool. And therefore, I'm paying extra close attention to how we ourselves perform asset management, and that helps start conversations with our customers and prospects regarding why they should be paying attention to the tool that we're positioning for them. So as you can see, some aspects of my role might be unique to being a CISO of a company that is a security vendor, maybe. But we're all vendors to somebody. And I bet that the program goals that we define for ourselves are at least to some extent similar to the program goals that you have defined for yourself or that might already exist in your organization, perhaps with some other team, depending on where you are. So anyway, this is how we began thinking about what it is we're trying to achieve and why we're here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we already had a variety of very reasonable security practices that were happening, but the notion of a security program involves bringing all of them together and making sure that all of these security measures are repeatable, are consistent, are overseen and managed. So that's what I mean by organizing the security program. And it is very helpful to not invent your own approach for organizing all of the security measures that you already have or are trying to implement. It helps to use an established framework so that instead of saying, in my experience, your experience might be valuable, but it is just an experience of one person, you can somehow refer to the experience of many others who have collaborated to create an approach that helps you decide what security measures to implement and perhaps how to implement them. So here's what I found useful early, at least early in the process. I was thinking, what can I do? And one starting point that you can look into, depending on what industry you're in, is any prescriptive guidelines that are unique to your particular industry. If you're in healthcare, maybe you look at HIPAA and high tech. If you're processing credit card numbers, then of course you would look at PCI DSS. Those of you who are in an industry that has such prescriptive regulatory or contractual requirements, to some extent are unlucky because you have to deal with a lot of auditors, and sometimes that is not very pleasant. But you're also lucky because you can refer to that specific set of controls that someone else said you have to follow and say, we have to follow them. And now there's less persuasion that you have to engage in. But even if you have those prescriptive security measures, you might not find them enough. Their scope might be too narrow. So another starting point for those of you who are in young companies and startups is this checklist that came out a few months ago. Several well-regarded security professionals from a variety of companies got together and created this Security for Startups controls checklist that I think is very reasonable. This is also quite prescriptive. It is somewhat arbitrary in that this is the opinion of those security professionals regarding what they think startups should implement at the beginning of their security program. But it's a well-informed opinion, and I'm always drawn to any project where different people collaborate across various industries and agree on something. This consensus-based approach, I find, produces a reasonable starting point. And here's an interesting framework for young companies. Now, if you're looking for something a bit more established, a bit more formalized, then I found it very useful to look at CIS critical controls. Now here, remember, you're not just trying to decide what security measures should you formalize, where to identify gaps, what should you have that might be missing. You also need to persuade others, your colleagues, your peers, your managers. Maybe you need to be talking about a budget that wasn't available to you, and we'll talk about budget a little bit later on in this session. It helps if you can refer to an established framework so that when you tell somebody we need, I don't know, centralized log management, or we need a better asset management, or we need vulnerability scanning, you don't simply say, because I said so, because I'm an experienced person, I think it's a good idea. I mean, I wish it worked that way. In many cases, you also need to substantiate your opinion by pointing to someone else and says, see, others thought it was a good idea as well. That helps move the conversation forward. And what I like about CIS critical controls, actually, there's quite a lot I like about this framework. First of all, it's not very large. you can actually read it without falling asleep. Also, it is based on input from very different organizations that came together, both from the private and public sector, and the security measures that exist within it are all tied to some specific attacks that you can protect yourself against if you implement the controls that the framework talks about. So this is not all theoretical. This is based on practical advice from security professionals. And a lot of people recognize the as critical control, so you don't need to spend too much time explaining why this is a reasonable framework. I found it to be quite useful as a starting point. Now, ISO 27001, oh boy. This is an international standard. It is not very expensive. You have to buy the document, but if you have a company that justifies having a security person on staff, they can probably justify paying a few $100s to get a copy of this document. And it does tell you what your security program should consider including as part of its scope. But I find that ISO 27001 is very bureaucratic, and I just don't find it especially helpful for defending my environment or for just really, I guess I just don't like the bureaucracy associated with it. But we have been certified by an auditor to be compliant with this framework, so it's a thing that I have to deal with anyway. There is some usefulness to it. Most notably, it is a well-established framework that auditors understand, that many of your customers know about, and so if you need some additional guidance regarding what to implement, then you can look at that framework. It really depends on what kind of country and industry you operate in. Now, there's also another large framework that requires some time to think about and to understand, and that is the NIST cybersecurity framework. And I found personally this framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, to be much more useful to me in organizing my security controls, in thinking about how do I make sure that I don't try to implement everything at once, but at the same time keep track of my progress as I continue to mature our security program. So kudos to NIST for creating this framework. If you haven't looked at it, again, it's not quite as approachable as CS critical controls, but it is much more ambitious in its objectives and its scope. So my point is, find a framework that's established that you can point to and at least use as guidance or as a starting point for determining how to organize your security program. I found these references to be particularly useful. Now, then I needed to explain to others what it is I'm doing. And specifically, I needed to explain to the board the first time I had an opportunity to present to them what my objectives are and why my role is defined the way that it is. And here is the approach that I took that worked pretty well. Here's the pyramid that I showed. When you talk to people that are not technologists, visualization goes a long way, and I'm not a great visualizer, but here's the extent of my graphic design skills. I was able to draw this triangle. Here's what I explained. I explained that there are a variety of functions that my team should be performing. And these functions I got from the NIST cybersecurity framework. I think this is a reasonable way of taking this abstract notion of cybersecurity program management and splitting it into 5 types of activities. First, you need to identify where it is you're operating, what your security objectives are, and what it is you are trying to safeguard. That's situational awareness. Then you need to think about how do you protect that business process set or that infrastructure or those applications. Then you need to think about how you're going to detect when your preventative measures fail. Then you need to consider how to respond once you detect an incident, and eventually you need to recover and return to business. This is from the NIST cybersecurity framework, but you can describe this at a high level to a business person and they will understand what you're talking about. I found this a useful conversation starter with the executive management and our board. Then you can talk about how these 5 high-level functions actually are comprised of several different categories. And I talked about NIST and how it defines 23 categories of activities that involve asset management, governance, identity management and access control, data security, and so on and so forth. Here, my goal was to explain that there are a variety of categories of projects that we might need to undertake, and that you cannot possibly implement all of this at once. You need to find those that are most appropriate, that are most relevant to the company at a given point in time, and proceed with those. Then I explained that within each of these control categories, there are the individual controls. There is some guidance that the NIST cybersecurity framework provides, and there's some additional documents that you can get from NIST regarding what it means to implement asset management or identity management. And ultimately, you actually have to do the work and implement whatever controls your framework is talking about. That means defining policies that explain your activities, implementing technologies that you need to enable those controls, and creating some kind of practices where you use the technology to implement the control as described in your policy. So this is how I'm thinking about the variety of activities that me and my team need to engage in, and this is how I'm keeping this organized and how I was able to explain to the board that the nature of managing our security program is structured, that there is a method to this madness. I think that's very important because people outside of cybersecurity are not quite sure what this voodoo magic entails, and I think it's important to instill a sense of confidence that you know what you're doing by explaining that there's a structure, that you're following a methodology. And I like the fact that I'm not claiming to have invented this methodology, but that it is based on one that many other organizations have adopted and have done so successfully. So I found that this was quite useful for me. But what I started doing was organizing my plans. And I think I overdid it initially. I spent a lot of time in my spreadsheet where I was documenting what we're doing for this category of controls and that category of controls. And I realized that I can spend weeks in my mega spreadsheet, keeping everything organized and sorted and color-coded, and nothing will actually happen outside of my spreadsheet. So you do need to keep yourself organized. But when it comes down to it, you have to implement. You have to deploy technologies that you need. You have to implement processes. You have to actually do stuff. So this might be obvious to you, but I got caught in this idea of being organized, and I have a tendency to do so. And I realized that, you know what, I cannot plan everything out perfectly, especially given that I don't know exactly what future might entail. You need to balance this idea of staying organized, using a framework, but at the same time, you got to start doing some stuff. And so my own lesson number one was, should I start from bottom up or top down? Should I plan everything out and then start implementing, or should I just start doing stuff and then see where those security measures fall in some kind of a framework? For me, it needs to be a balanced approach, not surprising, I suppose. So a little bit of planning, then some implementation, then go back to planning, then go back to implementation. This is something that I found helped me keep myself organized and sane. Now, let's talk about my second lesson. My second lesson has to do with time. How long should it take to formalize a security program? How long should it take? Are we talking a couple of weeks, a couple of months, years, decades? All right. So here is what was happening in my environment. Initially, we decided to start formalizing our practices with the following projects. The first project was to roll out centralized secrets management for our employees. I'm talking about using software that is a password vault, like LastPass, for example, or 1Password or Dashlane. There are corporate versions of the software. And this was a pretty easy win for us because nobody likes remembering all these passwords. They keep reusing them. That creates risk for the company, and it creates an inconvenience for the employees. So this helped our employees make sure that they select strong passwords, but they don't need to try to remember them. Then we implemented single sign-on. Again, authenticating to systems, dealing with those passwords is such a point of friction that initially we were looking for something that improves the company's security posture, but also makes it easier for our employees to do their jobs. And that's one of those win-win scenarios that I feel single sign-on really helps, because people don't need to sign in to as many websites as they used to. Sometimes this mechanism can auto-sign you in. They don't need to remember many passwords. It's quite wonderful when it works properly. A related project that we had was streamlining employee onboarding and offboarding. This was a manual, painful process. When an employee joined the company, we had to manually provision a variety of accounts in various systems, and of course that means time. There is a chance of making an error. And so here, once again, we were looking for an opportunity to improve security, and automation means consistent practices for granting and removing access, but at the same time, save people time so that they don't need to do manual work, and they're happy, and the company is more secure. Centralized endpoint management is another project that we wanted to just improve on because of how our endpoints are being managed, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about some of those challenges later on in this session. So the projects that I shared with you, these were the projects that appealed to us, and I explained to you why that was the case. In your case, you might have different projects that would give you some easy wins and improve security as well as user experience. But ultimately, you will need to justify budget. And I'm talking about, certainly if you're buying a commercial product, you need to justify paying money for it, and that money has to come from somewhere. But also, you will need to justify spending people's time deploying a technology or creating some kind of a process, even if it does not involve buying any products. So here's what I realized, and hey, maybe this is obvious to you, but it took me some time to realize this. I'm used to thinking about defense in depth. I'm a security person. I realized that one security layer might fail, so we should build redundancy, so to speak. That's the concept of defense in depth. But I realized that when you talk to others, your managers, for example, those who approve your budget, you cannot simply say, I need this better endpoint security tool because we have one, I want to keep that one too, but it's not good enough, or I have this kind of logging, but it's not good enough, I want to have a second logging. These all might be practical security measures that you think are important. But the problem with using defense in depth for justifying your expenses is that it never answers the question, how many layers is enough? You've got a personal firewall in the system, you've got a network firewall at the local subnet, then you've got all the traffic through your organization being tunneled through yet another point where some traffic inspection occurs. I don't know, you've got 3 layers. Is that enough? Should you add the 4th one? Or maybe only 2 is enough, or maybe 1. You see what I mean? It does not answer the question, how many security layers is enough? So a budget approver realizes that you'll just keep coming back and asking for more layers if you don't have any better justifications. So instead, I find, perhaps in an obvious way, but now that I reflect on it, I realize it's obvious, I need to tie my projects, my budget requests, to some meaningful business risks and initiatives. That's how I need to justify. I'm trying, I need to purchase this vulnerability scanning tool because we have customers that demand that we remediate vulnerabilities within 30 days or something like that, right? You got to explain that to you as a security person. That might be obvious, but to whoever is approving your budget, that might not be obvious. You need to state it up front. Also, I talked earlier about the usefulness of referring to established frameworks. This is very helpful because it allows the person approving your budget to realize that what you're asking for is not unusual, it's not weird, it's a thing that other companies, perhaps in your industry or in your geography, also have. And if you don't have it, then maybe you don't need it, but at least that's worth talking about. So this is not the reason to get it. You should not buy product X just because your neighbor has product X, but this could be a part of your conversation, and it could help you in being more persuasive. You can point to, I don't know, some consulting company that the decision maker trusts. You can point to some research, I don't know, from SANS. You can point to analyst firms. You can point to a penetration report that you have commissioned, you can point to some other company in your space that had a risk that they should have addressed, and you want to learn from their efforts. And then you need to make sure that you know how much to ask for. And actually, this was hard for me, perhaps surprisingly. I've been in the security industry for a while, but when I bought security products last a few years ago, I was doing that in the context of a very large organization. And I had a lot of purchasing power and negotiating power. And the prices that I was getting in a large organization were drastically different when I was buying in bulk than what I, as a much smaller company, am getting when I buy smaller quantities, and therefore my discount levels are different. So I was surprised at how much work it took to actually determine the actual costs. And you need to remember to, of course, include in your ask not only the software licensing, but also people's time and infrastructure time and support costs. So you have decided what technologies you might want to deploy or what security improvements you want to make. You got the budget for it. Now you also need buy-in from other people in the organization. Even something as convenient that you might think is nice, like a password vault, people might not like it. They might be afraid of storing all of their passwords. It might be unfamiliar technology. So here's my take on the 4 stages of security projects that you're trying to roll out. Oftentimes, take this as a tongue-in-cheek, frankly, but look, initially you talk to people and you say something like, look, I have a budget for it. Wouldn't it be nice if we had such and such security tool? Wouldn't that be nice? And theoretically, people might agree with you because they're trying to be agreeable and supportive, and it sounds fine until they actually realize that the security measures that you're implementing sometimes do add friction to their work. And so the next step might be skepticism. Now that they're actually starting to use your thing, or now that they're digging deeper into what that means and their workflows might need to change, they're starting to get a bit skeptical about it. Maybe I shouldn't have agreed so easily. Then you enter a period of negotiations. If you're looking to gain support, and usually as a security person, you need to gain support of your colleagues, of your peers, there's some negotiations. Hey, you wanted to, I don't know, enable all possible, you wanted to activate endpoint protection at the aggressive level, and it sounded good because we were going to be very, very protected against malware. But now I realize that in the real world, aggressive means too many false positives. It's actually breaking the software that I need to use. Let's find some common ground. Let's negotiate. I call this bargaining. And eventually, hopefully, there's acceptance. Hopefully, you've persuaded your the necessary stakeholders, you got support for this project, and eventually that allows you to roll this out. So I'm simplifying things, and again, I think this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek approach to thinking about security projects. But any security measure that I introduce is likely to introduce friction. Yeah, that's what security does. I mean, it's great to think about security as a way that helps you move forward. You know, there's this saying that I quite like, that security should be like brakes in the car. Yes, it slows you down, but that's ultimately what allows you to move faster. That sounds nice when you tell it as a story, but practically, when you tell somebody that you're going to introduce the security measure and now it'll take them I don't know, an hour longer to get their code checked in because it has to run through various checks. Now they're not quite as happy as they maybe were initially when you're talking about introducing the security measure. So this is hard, especially if you're in a fast-growing company. Your security measures introduce friction. They slow down. They oftentimes conflict with the culture of a fast-growing company, and that means going through talking to people, gaining their support, persuading, and making it clear how the security measure ultimately makes your company better off. So my second lesson was that it takes time to do everything that I just discussed with you. Maybe I was naive, probably I was naive, but I thought, hey, we're not a very large company, and we already have some pretty sound security measures. So how long will it take to organize everything and identify the gaps that we might have and address them? We're pretty small. It shouldn't take that long. And what I realized is size does not matter when it comes to the velocity of maturing a security program, because ultimately the challenges that I'm facing are actually the same challenges that I would be facing if I was working in a larger organization. Yes, not quite identical, but you still need to have the same security controls if you're looking at ISO 27001 or NIST cybersecurity framework. And the fact that you have a smaller company does not automatically mean you'll be able to move faster. You still have the same types of departments. You still have the same types of resistance to change, resistance to friction. So yeah, creating a security program takes time. And those of you who are perhaps more experienced at this work are thinking, yeah, of course, that's obvious. Well, sometimes you have to experience and learn these things on your own. So I've realized that when it comes to building or maturing a security program, it is just as hard and perhaps just as long to do so in a smaller organization as in a larger organization. And the key here to moving faster, I think, is just aligning your security initiatives to business objectives. All right, lesson number 3. Could we simplify our security and IT architecture? And the reason why this is worth considering, at least, is because in general, the simpler the system, the easier it is to secure. In contrast, the more moving parts you have, well, the more things there are to lock down, and the greater the chances that when you lock down one thing, something else is going to break. So that was the question that was going through my mind when I was just starting out, and I was thinking, we've got a lot of tools that we're using. Could we just consolidate them all and standardize on one vendor for corporate security, perhaps? So here are the types of tools that maybe you're using. Some of these, many of these we're using as well. I think these tools you will find are quite representative of what is present in a modern enterprise. And when I use the term enterprise, I'm really talking about a business that is both small and large. You've got a variety of operating systems nowadays available: Macs, Windows, Linux. You've got people using Microsoft Office, maybe G Suite. Maybe some processes are relying on Microsoft. Others might be relying on, I don't know, maybe you're using, some of your teams are using Microsoft Teams, others are using Slack. Maybe you've got Box for file sharing. Maybe you've got Google Drive. If your organization is selling to anyone, they're probably using Salesforce. Now, what about teleconferencing? Are you using Zoom? Ooh. Or are you using GoToMeeting? Are you? Sometimes the answer is yes to both. Here's my point. It used to be a long time ago when I thought that the world is moving towards consolidation of IT vendors, and it really felt for some time that people are just going to pick a vendor and stick with it. Maybe that vendor would be Oracle, or maybe Microsoft, or maybe IBM, maybe CA. But maybe that was too naive for me to think about that way. Because what is happening right now is that no, business users want best of breed. And for some scenarios, they want a product that comes from one vendor, sometimes from another. Sometimes they want to buy this innovative product from a startup. Sometimes they want to go to an established company like IBM. So this is what the security teams have to deal with. The modern enterprise is heterogeneous, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. In fact, just the opposite is happening. I was interested in reading a report that Okta published a few months back. Okta is a provider of single sign-on and has visibility into the types of applications that their customers are using. And look at this. Okta pointed out in that report that the demand for app diversity continues to grow. This year, the average number of apps per customer reached 88, up from 83 from last year, right? So that means that their enterprise customers, a single customer, on the average, is using 88 applications. And 10% of their customers apparently deploy 200 apps or more. This is the kind of heterogeneity that I'm talking about. That's just the modern world. And securing all of our interactions with so many different applications that come from so many different providers, that's hard, and you cannot fight it. This is just how the business is operating. So if you think that you're going to try to say, how about we just consolidate? How about we use fewer apps? How about we go everything from Google or everything from Microsoft? I think you're being unrealistic. Not for everything, maybe for at least some components, but not for everything. Here's something else that I found interesting. What about the security tools that we're using? So at Axonius, we worked with ESG to conduct a survey recently. And one of the questions that ESG posed to people is, how many security tools is your organization using? And the answer came out to be, on the average, 108 separate security tools. So that heterogeneity that I'm talking about in the enterprise as a whole, it actually exists within our own teams. Not necessarily your team specifically, because in a large organization, there might be silos and different departments might be using some tools that they believe are related to security, but wow, 108 security tools. I was truly surprised to see this information. So you, as a CISO, need to organize all of these security tools. Do you have all the tools that you need? Do you have too many? How can you tell? And here's what helped me. This was a very helpful approach, which is a matrix that a gentleman named Sunil Yu designed. He calls this the cyber defense matrix. And if you look it up online, you'll find it quite easily. What you see in this matrix is, in the columns, the familiar NIST categories: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. You could just look at these categories and think, what kind of security tools do I need to identify stuff or to detect incidents? But that's not granular enough. Now, you could look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, and there's enough granularity there to help you figure this out, but that can be very overwhelming, and I certainly found it very overwhelming at the onset of my journey. So what Sunil says, and I think this is a wonderful observation, is that you can think about the tools that you have or the tools that you need from the perspective of these columns that I just talked about, but also as they apply to different types of assets that your security program needs to oversee. That's the rows that you see in this matrix. You need to secure devices, applications, networks, data, and users. So here is a matrix that you can use, and you can start drawing in it and filling it in. What tools or security measures do you have to identify devices, or to protect your networks, or to detect security incidents with your data, or to respond to suspected breaches of your user accounts? This is the exercise that I went through, and it was very helpful, because I was thinking about so much that we might want to look into, and it was easy to get overwhelmed. And this matrix helped me really avoid some stress and get my thoughts together. So I found that this was a convenient way to begin thinking about my toolkit and which tools should I use, open source, commercial tools, should I replace some of my existing ones. This was useful in the very beginning. At some point, I found that I outgrew this matrix, and I became more comfortable using the fuller NIST cybersecurity framework. But this matrix, at the onset of my journey, I found it to be quite useful. Now, when you are selecting a commercial product, here's what I encountered. Yeah, some products I decided that we need to buy, wanted to evaluate several products, wanted to understand the pricing, and so on and so forth. I alluded to this earlier, but what I realized is that as a relatively small company, I have a hard time getting vendors' attention. And it's very reasonable. It's not surprising. I'm not complaining about it. That's just how it is. The deal sizes are too small. So when I go to a security provider and I say that I'm interested in purchasing their product, they try to size the deal, and they realize that my company's very small. They're not going to make a whole lot of money on me, so they're not going to pay as much attention to me as they would to a much larger enterprise. So this means that you have to work harder to gain the vendor's attention if you think that their products are worth evaluating. You need to learn about the product through webinars, recorded videos. In many cases, I found that companies whose security tools I wanted to learn about better have public documentation sites that I could just browse through. Also, I found it to be that it was easier to get the attention of value-added resellers, of VARs, that resell various security products. I think the reason for this is because, first of all, they're set up to work with smaller businesses. Also, if you buy several technologies from them, then that overall size of the deal is actually attractive to them because it's larger than a single tool you would buy from a single vendor if you went to them directly. So that was quite helpful, and perhaps not surprisingly, I found it to be quite useful to just talk to other CISOs, to my friends in the industry, and ask them about experiences and ask them about which products in a given category I should look at and which vendors they had a positive or negative experience with. And all of this takes time. All of this takes time. So one of my lessons is that, yeah, you got to set time aside to do these evaluations properly. It's hard. It's hard to get to know certain products, especially if you've got a small team or if you don't have the expertise to dig deeply into that product's capabilities. You need to take some time if you don't want to take the vendor's word for the effectiveness of their tool. So my lesson number 3 is to not fight the diversity of applications and vendors and providers in my environment. Consolidation is not an option, at least it was not for me. So I needed to embrace that diversity, build my security program, assuming that it'll continue to be diverse. And also, when looking at my security tools, I had to pick and choose and decide which ones I want to start with, because trying to replace or overhaul your whole toolkit, it's just not going to happen. It's too draining. Even if you have the budget to buy all that stuff, which you probably don't, you need time to evaluate the tools properly. All right, let's move on to my lesson number 4. And the question that I was asking myself is, what's the big deal and all the hoopla around zero trust? Zero trust, which is the notion that when you define your security measures, you should not give access to some sensitive resource merely because the user is coming from a trusted network. You have to assume that the networks are all untrusted, and instead you should look at the context of the request. You should identify the user, and if you can, you should validate that the device from which the user is accessing is trustworthy. So is this practical? To me, what are people doing with this regard? So I was thinking about security and IT architecture. So remember, I talked about how we have diverse IT assets, right? They're very diverse. There is no more of the notion of a corporate network. Now, in your environments, that might not have been the case until recently. Until recently, many organizations had the corporate network, and if you go into the office, you would be connected to the corporate network, and oftentimes you had privileges that were given to you just because you're connecting from the network that was considered trusted. Well, of course, our pandemic made it so that employees are no longer able to go into the offices, and the organization had to very quickly figure out what to do when there is no corporate network. For us, there was never really a corporate network. I don't think a lot of organizations start a brand new business today by thinking, well, let's rent some office space and set up a big corporate network, get us a couple of domain controllers, buy a few expensive Cisco routers. I just don't think so. Instead, what they do is they buy a bunch of laptops and they use cloud-based and software as a service tools to develop their product and conduct their business. So in the modern world, maybe you're not there quite yet, but you're definitely going into that space. There's no centralized corporate network. The employees are distributed. And they're using primarily and at some point exclusively cloud-based services. They're deploying code to run as VMs or other payloads in public cloud environments. They're accessing software as a service applications. So there is no thing that you decide to install locally and you can secure it. What that means is that if there's a problem with some SaaS application, you're really at the mercy of the vendor to try to troubleshoot it, and that's a scary thing, yeah. So what I was thinking about when trying to make sense of this architecture for IT and security, at least that made sense for our company, is where do security responsibilities and IT responsibilities begin? What is IT and what is security nowadays? And I still haven't quite figured out the answer to this question. But it's important, because if you as a CISO are trying to understand what it is you're responsible for, then where do you draw the line and say, actually, this thing is supposed to be IT operations, or this is supposed to be help desk that the IT team takes care of. I suspect where that line is drawn depends on the company and your personnel, I suppose. Now, also, where do I start as the root of trust when I decide whether to grant a user access to a given resource, or whether the user should be allowed to take a certain action to the resource to which they previously authenticated? In the olden days, let's say, or at least what I was used to, was Active Directory. Active Directory, I knew it well. I relied on group policy. I relied on authentication and user identity management that I got from Active Directory. But it doesn't work so well on its own when you've got employees distributed everywhere, when there's such a heterogeneous environment. So what to do? And so for me, it made sense to look at an identity management provider that knew how to authenticate and how to control access and privilege and manage privileges for a heterogeneous environment. And there are a number of vendors in the space. They begin by offering single sign-on. Once you do single sign-on to the compatible applications, usually they might be SaaS applications, then you can use this identity provider to, of course, define users, yes, but also define how you want to validate and authenticate the user, enable multi-factor authentication, decide whether you want to look at the state of the device as part of your decision, whether to give access. This gives you a lot of oversight. And then also, I mentioned earlier that an easy, well, not an easy, but a successful project for us at least was automating user provisioning and deprovisioning. And by focusing on a vendor that provides identity management the way that appeals to you, or in my case, the way that appealed to my team, this was very successful for us. So we were able to bring almost all of our applications under a single sign-on provider, and this gives us great visibility into who's doing what, finding anomalies, investigating potential incidents, enforcing security policy. So I really encourage you to look into the space if you haven't had an opportunity to do so already. But don't get your hopes up if you think you can just enable single sign-on across all of your services. I mean, all of your services, if they're a SaaS application, support single sign-on. That's SAML-based. That's the industry standard. That's what you want. You want SAML-based single sign-on. Unfortunately, in some cases, you will have to pay an arm and a leg to enable single sign-on support in your SaaS application. Buying single sign-on as a feature from your identity provider, that's relatively straightforward. That's inexpensive. But making sure that all of your SaaS applications accept SAML-based single sign-on capabilities, well, so there's this wonderful website, SSO.tax, also known as the SSO Wall of Shame, that lists vendors who charge a lot of money for the privilege of allowing you to enable single sign-on inside of their applications. And I'll call out some of these vendors because this, I think, this practice does a disservice to the community. Atlassian, DocuSign, GitHub, Slack, Box, all of these vendors require that you upgrade to an enterprise bundle of their product. And I think that companies should charge for features. You know, if you're a commercial entity, you exist to make profit, you need revenue, and when you add value, you should be able to charge for it. But if you're going to be charging for single sign-on, I'd like for that to be a single feature that I can buy and pay for, please. Don't force me to buy a set of other features that I don't need and therefore cannot afford. So some of these bundles that you're forced to buy to enable the SSO privilege cost 2, 3, sometimes 4 times the cost of the base product. And that is my sandbox. This is my soapbox from which I'm going to get off right now. Now, automating manual tasks, another project that is very helpful. I alluded to this earlier, but automation is so good for security because you make sure that things happen consistently and that there is no human error that introduces risk. So can you automate user provisioning and diff provisioning? That was one of the first projects that we implemented, and it was a huge boost to just productivity of people across the company. What about the way that you review alerts or access information? Can you automate tasks related to identifying security configuration problems? That was also something that we did early on that was just very, very convenient to just automatically get alerts when assets are out of compliance with the expected security state, or when access happens in an anomalous way, for example. And yeah, that has to do with making sure that my asset management practices are automated, because, well, that's where a lot of risk would come from. When a server or an application or a virtual machine is misconfigured or exists and I don't even know about it, we automated that kind of oversight. So automation benefits your team, addresses risks, helps you drive forward your own initiatives, but it also helps other teams because it makes them more efficient. And that's a win-win, and that's not very common in security quite often. So my lesson number 4 is essentially nowadays it's zero trust or bust. If you don't exist in this world, you will exist in it soon. Due to the pandemic, you probably have made already a number of decisions that have taken you forward towards that journey. And if you're interested, just read up on what zero trust means. I was initially very skeptical of this buzzword because just whenever I feel something feels like a buzzword, I naturally try to resist it. But there's a lot of substance, a lot of useful industry practices and information about what it means to create a zero trust architecture. So zero trust or bust, but you'll pay more for SSO. Now you can try to negotiate with your vendors and maybe they'll be nice to you, and sometimes they are. Or sometimes you don't have any negotiating power, which means you will either have to forego enabling single sign-on or just request more funding for it. All right, my 5th lesson learned, the last one that I wanted to discuss with you. How does it feel to be a CISO? I've read about it, but it's been a while since I was one, so how does it feel? Well, let's talk about the stress level. In fact, before I talk about my own stress level, let me refer to some studies. Osterman Research had a survey that said that 91% of CISOs say they suffer moderate or high stress. Is this surprising to you? Perhaps not if you're a CISO. Also, the study found that nearly 17% of CISOs are either medicating or using alcohol to deal with job stress. Now, this sounds bad if I say it with a strong voice like this, but actually, maybe this is normal. Maybe 17% of all people are either medicating or using alcohol to deal with job stress. So I don't know, but this doesn't sound very good. It overall sounds like CISOs are under a lot of stress. What about the job tenure? Because stress usually means that you burn out and then look for another job. All right, here's another study. This one is done by ESG. And this survey found that the average tenure of a CISO is between 2 and 4 years. So a CISO lasts about between 2 and 4 years at a given company on the average. Is this bad or is this good? What's the average tenure of a C-level executive? It is actually longer than this. So this is quite unusual. C-level executives usually last longer at a company. So this is a red flag. And why are the CISOs most likely to leave the organization? Here are some of the reasons that ESG survey discovered. Organization doesn't have a corporate culture that emphasizes security. CISOs offer the higher compensation package elsewhere, and CISOs find that they're not active participants with executive management or board of directors. So this is why CISOs leave after 2 to 4 years. So on the one hand, if you're a CISO, I guess the job market is relatively hot. So if you don't like where you are, you can go somewhere else. But of course, you can make a much more meaningful impact if you stick around your job for a bit longer. And that means complaining about the corporate culture? I don't know. Perhaps trying to change it. Changing cultures is hard. I'll mention that a little bit later on. But yeah, the biggest issues that we need to deal with is gaining acceptance, earning our seat at the C-level table, getting buy-in from our peers and other executives, and of course, gaining support from the board of directors. So what does that mean in terms of the responsibilities that the CISO has, and how might they contribute to our stress levels? Here are some of the things that I believe a CISO typically does. Identify cybersecurity risks, propose risk mitigation approaches, and create a culture that encourages informed, risk-aware decisions. I mean, this is just my opinion. You might disagree with it, but this is what I'm thinking about. And finally, manage the cybersecurity program. Look, every CISO role is a bit different, but I believe these are parts of a CISO's job, and this can create a lot of stress. But here is what I think is the biggest stress factor, and it is something that I need to constantly remind myself of. The CISO cannot own all security risk or remediation. It is not healthy and in fact not good for the enterprise to have a scenario where anytime somebody mentions the word security, people say, I don't know, why don't you talk to the CISO, right? The CISO does not control people's budgets or priorities. The CISO cannot order others to do things that the CISO thinks should be done. And therefore, the CISO cannot own all security projects. Now, there are some security projects that the security team directly controls and manages, such as, let's say, the rollout of EDR capabilities and making sure that you have an incident response plan, but making sure that certain best practices are followed when software is being developed, or making sure that anytime you onboard a vendor, that a security review happens. Well, you need to influence to make sure that the right things happen there, but at some point, you need to realize that you cannot control everything that other people are trying to do. This is something that I'm still trying to come to terms with and trying to better explain to myself. But to me, it feels like a major source of stress for CISOs is trying to do everything for everyone and help everyone with anything related to security, rather than creating an environment where other people are empowered to make risk-related decisions informed by the guidance that we provide. So this one is still a work in progress for me. This is as much as I can share with you about it at a given moment in time. But some observations related to you succeeding at influencing others and making sure that the risks are getting the right treatment. Here they are. You must have a board level and CEO level support. It's critical, but it's just not enough. It's not enough to have this top-down support only. You need to have support from your peers, from your colleagues, from the rest of the company. And that means that you need to track whatever improvements you're implementing, and you need to market yourself and your team, and you need to communicate how your recent projects have benefited the company and helped other people in other groups. So a CISO and the security team has to take on a certain internal marketing function to share your contributions with others. And of course, the board and your manager and CISO want to know, well, how are you doing? Are you contributing something useful? And also, this is something that I have learned, you need to, let's use the term, lean into confrontations in a professional and a constructive way. This is hard for me. I like to agree with people. I like to be friendly, and I don't want conflict. I shy away from conflict. But I need to fight my nature sometimes to really recognize that there will be disagreements. And I need to defend my position, and then I need to understand where the other party is coming from, and it is through this disagreement conducted in a professional way, the best decisions, the best choices will be made for the company. And to achieve any of this, the CISO really needs to understand the company's culture. I mentioned earlier that one of the roles of a CISO, I believe, is to create a culture where risk is being taken into account when various business decisions are being made. That is very, very hard to do, especially since you're already usually in a place that has some culture in it. You need to understand it, work within the aspects of the culture that you think are favorable to your objectives, and see how you can gradually, slowly change the aspects of the culture that need to be adjusted. And that involves building relationships across the board with people everywhere. Building relationships, I think, is one of the most important tasks of a CISO, and I aspire to keep improving my own skills at doing that. So my lesson number 5 is this. I had to realize that I need to master the manic cycle of ups and downs. This is really how the job feels to me. There are some days where I'm just overjoyed with the support that I got from somebody for an initiative that I thought was important, that I thought would get resistance, and people said, yeah, let's do it, and it was fantastic. Or there might be a wonderful day when we finished rolling out this technology and it actually worked the way that it had to, and that was fantastic. There are other days where it's exactly the opposite, where I feel that my colleagues don't support me. I feel like I'm swimming upstream. I feel that the job that's ahead of me is just too hard. And the reality is that it's somewhere in between. But it really does feel like a cycle. There are those days that are up, there are days that are down, and I remind myself during the down day that tomorrow is going to be the up day, so things are going to be okay. In general, I am an optimist. And as I said earlier, don't try to own all security projects. Provide input, make sure that you are heard, provide reasonable and useful guidance. But if you don't control the resources, you cannot be responsible for the ultimate implementation or the risk that might come if the implementation doesn't happen. And so those are my 5 lessons learned that I had the pleasure sharing with you. Let me take a quick look at the questions that I got. There were some questions, let's see, and some comments as well. There was one comment that when evaluating commercial tools, in some environments, it's convenient to go through the formal RFP process and then do a proof of concept deployment. That really depends on the size of your organization, but if you've got the enough employees and enough formal processes for an RFP, sometimes that can be helpful indeed. Let's see, what else I've got here. Well, just a bunch of really encouraging comments, and I really appreciate those. But it is time for us to wrap up this session. Before you go, I would very much appreciate it if you can click the link to the eval for today's session if you're tuning in live. I would love to know what you thought about all of this. And by the way, if you've got ideas and suggestions based on what you heard and you think that I'm screwing something up and that I misunderstood something, I'd love to hear from you as well. We're all learning here as the industry is progressing, the world is changing, our jobs are changing, we're taking on new roles. And so if you have any feedback from me, please feel free to reach out. You can find me on Twitter at Lenny Zeltser. You can easily find my email address online. All the vendors apparently have it, so I'm sure it's easy enough to find. So I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for your time.